Okay, so for our next topic in ecology, we're going to be looking at food webs and trophic levels, which are a fancy way to talk about just feeding levels in the food webs. So the first thing I want to recap is the flow of energy through ecosystems. So we talked briefly about this when we were talking about how matter cycles through ecosystems, but just to recap, most energy starts with sunlight. It goes into your producer group of organisms. Now those can get energy both from sunlight and chemicals. So we'll touch more on that in a second. From the producers, the energy flows into consumers, and those consumers have many levels. And then from there, they pass into the decomposers. Now that's the simple linear way of looking at it, but also remember that producers can be decomposed without ever being consumed by a consumer. And consumers can eat each other, and that at all steps in this process, energy is being lost as heat. So to go into a little more detail on the producers, we call them autotrophs or autotrophs. That's short for self-nutrition. So they feed themselves, and they do that using organic compounds, which they put together using energy from the sun or chemicals, and simple inorganic compounds, things like carbon dioxide and water. So what is an organic compound? Well, an organic compound are those molecules that contain carbon. There are a lot of them out there in the world, but we're going to focus primarily on carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And the big exception here, the molecule that contains carbon, but it's not considered organic, is CO2. And then there's our list of the organic compounds that we are primarily going to be concerned about. There is a whole lot more out there. And then lastly, I just want you to be very aware that producers support the rest of the ecosystem, the rest of the life in the ecosystem. They are the ones that are capable of building those organic compounds. So without them, you don't have a stable ecosystem. You may not have an ecosystem at all. So you have to have a stable base in place to support a stable ecosystem. So when you're looking at the producers, I've already hinted that there are two types of autotrophs. And so those two types are your photoautotrophs and your chemoautotrophs, the ones that can convert sunlight energy to organic molecules and the one that can convert chemicals to organic molecules. But the big picture here is they both create organic molecules using non-living sources of energy. And so that primary form that they're going to create is glucose. It is the most easily accessible form of energy for most living things. The photoautotrophs include things like plants, algae, cyanobacteria, probably the things you've thought of as producers. And then cyanobacteria, maybe you haven't thought that much about. It's also used to be called blue-green algae. So if you see anything called blue-green algae, that's been reclassified as cyanobacteria now. Archaea, or the archaea, those are most of your chemoautotrophs. So those ancient bacteria are doing most of the chemical to organic molecule transformations. This is a formula for photosynthesis, so you can see that a low energy carbon dioxide and a low energy water molecule is being converted with energy from the sun to oxygen and glucose. On the flip side, this is what a chemosynthesis equation would look like. There's a lot of different ones because many different chemicals can be converted into organic molecules, but they do that using energy from the compounds themselves. And so oxidation is when ions lose electrons, and those electrons are transferred into higher energy molecules. And so we use that energy to build a glucose. Your consumers are also known as heterotrophs, so they're your different or your outside feeders. So they depend on other organisms for their food. and they have to consume that food, those organic molecules. So when you look at the many types of consumers, you probably are all familiar with herbivores, the ones that eat only producers. That does include bacteria, especially things called zooplankton. So they would eat your phytoplankton, your algae, and your cyanobacteria. So zooplankton is the one spelled zoo and then plankton, but we pronounce it zooplankton. Carnivores eat only consumers. Those are your animals primarily, but there are a few plants like Venus flytraps that can get nutrition from eating consumers. And then we are omnivores, so we eat on both levels. Most humans choose to eat this way. Some choose to not eat meat, so they are eating as herbivores. But if you look at our teeth, we have teeth specialized for chewing meat and teeth specialized for grinding up plants. So we are omnivores, and you see that pattern of tooth shape in all the omnivores. And then there's the ones that I like to call the cleanup crew, and a lot of these terms are used interchangeably. There's a lot of overlap between the three of them depending on whose definition you're using. So here are my simple definitions to try and make them as clear and different from each other as possible. But we need all of these to kind of pick up our dead and decomposing organic matter. So scavengers are the ones that actually go out and feed on dead carcasses, but they don't eat everything, even though they eat large amounts of dead fleshy matter. Detritivores are eating your detritus, so that's your organic matter that's already starting to decompose. Maybe, these would be things like your dung beetles, your millipedes. They're coming and they're actually feeding on that decomposing organic matter. That's slightly different from decomposers because they're absorbing the nutrients from decomposing matter, and so this is, fungi would be an example of this. They can put out little hyphae and absorb chemically these broken down nutrients. So they're secreting chemicals to digest it outside their bodies, and then they're kind of absorbing the nutrients back in. There's a special category of decomposers called saprotrophs or saprophytes that are really, really good at breaking down the organic matter that nothing else can really break down, and so they complete that breakdown back into the inorganic components.